Thank you for this opportunity to share, Doug. CONUS, in the 80s, I transitioned my academic studies, sports training, work with Olympic development programs, to the development of two national youth leadership projects. The first grassroots project was substance abuse with the National Clearinghouse for Drug and Alcohol Information, 1990. It was the largest touch outreach ever coordinated through the Office for Substance Abuse Prevention. And the second was Hunger, Homelessness, and Poverty project across America, 133 cities, endorsed by the U.S. House Select Committee on Hunger in 93. After 93 project, we worked together to dissect a cross-section of unmet needs, working with frontline service programs in hundreds of U.S. cities, and formed Humanitarian Resource Institute, HRI, as a nonprofit organization in 1994. During the last 28 years, the work of HRI has expanded from the development of the HRI National City County Emergency Management Support Network. We developed in cooperation with FEMA as our first project, to formation of the International Disaster Information Network, IDEN, to assist FEMA with remediation for Y2K. These global networks, 193 UN member countries, were then used to address complex emergencies beyond the capabilities of governmental, UN, NGOs, and relief organizations. Well, CONUS, I've been working on global infrastructure analysis, contingency planning since developing the International Disaster Information Network for Y2K remediation. After Y2K, the network was expanded into biodefense, complex emergencies beyond the capabilities of governmental, UN, NGO, and relief organizations. In 2002, I formed the Humanitarian University Consortium to connect subject matter experts from colleges and universities in the UNESCO system in the 193 UN member countries. Our focus areas and projects and complex emergencies have encompassed West Nile virus, US, the 2001 UK FMD outbreak, foot and mouth disease, SARS, SARS-1, H5N1 pandemic, threats, the 2004 Indonesian tsunami, Iran 2009, the crisis that resulted from the 2010 period, extraction of forces from Iraq and Afghanistan, the village stability operations, Scott Mann's project, where the Green Berets were pulled from VSO, in the transition of IDEN to the Global Special Operations Network, Intelligence, Defense, Interpol, LEO fusion support occurred in 2011 with the formation of H2 OPSEC expeditionary operations. Since transitioning into defense, I've been actively involved in Syria, tracking that genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, progression into Crimea, 2014, Yazidi genocide, war crimes, Afghanistan, 2021, and the turnover of the Afghan government to the terrorist groups that helped plan 9/11, and Ukraine, 2022, which is the challenge we are now entrapped in. Advocacy, mediation, policy development are the focus of every international humanitarian security emergency, and that now spans over 130 countries classified as failed, failing, fragile states. For the last 28 years, I've specialized in advocacy and mediation, receipt of the prioritized emergency, connection with the world's top subject matter experts, formation of a solution-oriented strategic plan, collection of supporting peer-reviewed materials, and direct communication networks to decision-making level in the target demographic for real-time consensus building. Complex emergencies are handled with intensive real-time communications initiatives that reach the decision-making level in a target demographic. LinkedIn provides a glimpse of these initiatives. Beyond social media, HRI specializes in research, identification of target audience, effective integration of resources from telecommunications, direct mail, newspaper, radio, television, internet to achieve our communication objectives. Our networks, OCONUS, that are tied in with the international disaster information, our newspaper, radio, television, corporate, intergovernmental, non-governmental, United Nations, community action, interfaith organizations in 195 countries. CONUS, grassroots network, down to the household level, zip code, corporate, municipal, state, federal government, community action, and interfaith organizations in approximately 3,100 United States counties. So that's a starting point, a brief overview of HRI and H2 OPSEC.
So how did you make the transition from sports to being a humanitarian? What was that journey like?
Essentially, I was coaching, I was in scholarships, I was coaching Olympic development programs, and I was just in very, very privileged environments in those studies. And one thing I wanted to do was expand that out into youth leadership. So initiatives and expand access to that, the information that unless you were in a very unique situation, you wouldn't be able to tap. And so that evolved into the thoughts of coordinating a project that would be youth leadership oriented, that will allow a platform to speak on the work, training, the development process, all of the pieces that are involved in a elite development program, how to optimize to the doors that were open with the specific issues. And I set up a project in 1989. The project fell apart. I had the entire initiative structured. So I made some calls in Washington, ended up connecting with the communication liaison for the U.S. Secretary for Health and Human Services, and told them what we had structured in a 6,000-mile grassroots project through 160 cities, 60 cities across America. And he said, I have a project that we could fit right into this. We'll open the first toll-free hotline for the federal resource for drug and alcohol information through your project, and it will be touch outreach. And we'll support you through Washington and all the state radar network centers in all 50 states. And that initiative just expanded out. We went on the road, worked in the cities, met with the leaders, tied in with the media networks, and helped support a progressive build across the United States for the initiative. So that was the first project. Then I went and I spent a year in upstate New York, because one of the things that was most fascinating was that when I would go into the cities, into the central school districts and discuss the substance abuse materials, in many cases, they would tell me that they never heard of the Federal Resource for Drug and Alcohol Information, and they didn't know of all of the free print materials and audiovisual loan programs. And I had to set up a meeting and sit down with them in order to have them come to that realization of what was available and what they were paying money for through other pathways. So after that project was done, I went to upstate New York. We developed a network project that established pathways to disseminate information through 5 specific pathways into every household. And we set that up with the New York State Division of Substance Abuse Services, and just used already existing networks so we could have effective information dissemination beyond the media, right directly into the household. And then in 93, I was reading USA Today, and Oxfam America had a article on international relief organizations focusing on the United States because the problems were so severe. And I set up the whole next project. The 1990 project I did as a cycling project. So I did 100 miles a day, and then went into the cities and did all of the work, and went on to the next city, and we did that for the entire course. And then in 93, it was a run across America. So we ran, me and a partner ran 25 to 40 miles a day, and did the same thing in cities, going in, meeting with the executive directors of frontline programs, youth programs, getting an overview of unmet needs, providing a platform for communication of those unmet needs, for strategic planning and development, and just, again, did a progressive build in 133 cities between Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. And that was the real grassroots touch, outreach, connection component of what inspired the formation of HRI to address the unmet needs landscape. So we've been focused on bridging unmet needs to untapped resources for years.
Let's jump ahead. You mentioned Scott Mann, and it brings to mind a question. NGOs certainly have been in the fray of the world for generations, but something that it seems that we're seeing more of, especially with Afghanistan and now Ukraine, are the organizations, Scott Mann's Saving Our Allies, a lot of different groups that are saying, hey, the government's not taking care of these people, we're going to go in and do that. Do you see that as a natural evolution? Is that a one-off? Is this what's going to be going on maybe in other parts of the world? What are your thoughts on that?
I view it from a perspective of one of the most complicated challenges of working with human needs and suffering is the business side. So that's what makes this entire equation extremely complicated and difficult to work with. When you have 130 failing and fragile states where it's unsafe for UN, NGO, and relief workers to operate, we have a problem. So that's where my specialization went, was to that demographic. And Scott Mann and Village Stability Operations, and how NGOs fit into a stabilization, security, transition, or reconstruction model, and what phase of that, especially when you need to stabilize and secure the area before you can actively have people go in safely, is a whole foundational discussion.
So as you look, since you've been involved in these type of activities, do you find yourself becoming more, do you see the progress, or do you become discouraging? Sometimes as a former practitioner and now still involved in this area, it can become easy to become discouraged. What are your thoughts, and how do you keep yourself motivated in that there's this tragedy followed by the next one and followed by the next one?
Well, I started in an area which creates a lot of conflict. When I set up unmet needs networks with FEMA across the United States, we had huge challenges. The nonprofit umbrellas didn't want the negative information. The interfaith community didn't want information being communicated to their constituencies outside their control. Elected officials didn't want negative information flow, regardless of how substantive it was. So when you have problem sets in those kind of areas, and those are the types of challenges that are inhibiting you from effectively communicating to people that would want to respond, that is a very perplexing environment. So, you enter that pretty early on with these type of projects. With challenges like the tsunami in Indonesia, because I had all the emergency managers in 190 countries on network, when I got the USGS readings on the impact projections and the wave heights, I pulled demographic maps of the areas and the countries that were going to be in this impact area, and I put together a brief, and I communicated it out to the emergency management network. And what I saw was, within hours almost, a decision-making shift to send warships and military assistance to the areas because the problems were so big. So what that told me was those communication networks and what was communicated, if it got to the correct people, and we established consensus in a direction, that we could have very positive results. So every humanitarian challenge and emergency is really set up under that same type of framework. And a challenge like Syria, when you have evidence of genocide and war crimes, use of chemical weapons, crimes against humanity, the UN's writing torture reports on children and releasing them, and you have chemical attacks on civilian populations, and no one's moving because it's politically entangled. And we have P5 members of the UN Security Council that are blocking actions because they're perpetrators of crimes within those countries. You have limited success. We've watched upwards of 1 million people that are buried there in this emergency. And so whether it's Syria or it's Iran, doing advocacy work for the youth that are taking and opposing the election in Tehran and gaining traction, but then seeing a negative turn where then the government comes down hard on the picture, and who you're working with ends up dying. It's a negative sign. You have situations that are positive that result from these efforts, and they bring hope. And then you have the reality of complicated problems that have to really be drilled, and where consensus and support has to come from the right levels. It's like developing strategic plans in NATO, and from a defense standpoint, they're solid, but they have a civilian control metric that determines whether they're ever going to be applied. You got to be working all of those pieces and on top of the game, and you do that to the best of your ability every day.
Let me switch gears just a little bit but staying on topic. The current buzzword seems to be disinformation. How do you, as a practitioner, and when you're doing your research, sift through all the information to ensure that you're pulling the correct information and not somebody else's version of what they want you to see?
Working with the UK FMD crisis in 2001, and working with a lot of the top experts that were from Cambridge and these universities, and being core groups with these leaders taught me the importance of media, information that was disseminated by media, vetting, and how if I made one mistake by attributing an information source to an unreliable media source, that I would be disqualified almost instantaneously from the core groups. And that was where I began understanding which media sources you use and you confide in, and then you vet the information regardless of what they're communicating, but at least you have a starting point if you're going to reference the media source to something that's recognized as solid. When you have a challenge like a Ferguson, and one of the first focus areas we started looking at with national security was how Russia was running information operations, and they were using social media to communicate specific thought trains that were being grasped by that medium. And that was while they were inspiring these events. They were participating in the events. They were using the footage from the events for propaganda in their own country. And so that, going back, that's when a concentration on the disinformation side started coming in. And so being able to sift through and vet everything and focus on peer review, that really is the key to everything, is being able to back your source, which is the foundation of all of your academic studies.
So as you're looking out and we're seeing these new groups of people that are becoming activists and wanting to help, you know, I spoke with somebody from Save Our Allies recently, and half jokingly said, hey, if you need somebody to go on one of those planes, you know, I'm a little bit older, but I think I can still hang. And she laughed and said, well, interestingly enough, that's not where we have a problem. We have a lot of people, as she said, I have over 900 emails of people wanting to go. So as we have these new people entering, potentially, whether it's Ukraine or Afghanistan, what's the pitfalls, and is there a way to kind of self-regulate so that they're actually achieving, you know, a positive end state, and just instead of just getting in the way?
If I'm correct with interpreting the direction of your question, I'm an advocate of solving problems in countries instead of allowing them to collapse and having the population disperse and become a refugee burden. So it brings us back to what was the most effective metric in Afghanistan in relation to all military operations over the last 20 years. It was village stability operations. When you get down to the village level and you're able to stabilize and secure it, transition, reconstruct it, enable it to take and be self-sufficient, you have a metric for success. That success spread like fire when those Green Berets were in, and it was one of the greatest threats to the Taliban. So that has to be your focus. That has VSO and SSTR has to be your foreign internal defense focus. And and the strategies applied to these complex emergencies focused on stabilizing the country and providing them an opportunity to stay in their own home rather than allowing the entire picture to self-destruct and having 80 million forcibly displaced people like we have today. And we have massive internally displaced in Syria. And you could say that there's 40 million internally displaced in Afghanistan because the country is controlled by terrorist groups.
So with the lack of a Defense Department in some of these locations who are not providing that defense support to stability, is it just chaos, or do you see a way to take these metrics that have worked and move them over to a civilian organization?
The transition of the International Disaster Information Network to the Global Special Operations Network, Intelligence, Defense, Interpol, Fusion Support was counterterrorism focused. So when we had a challenge with a dominant country in relation to operations, what we're left with is effectively communicating all of the variables that are vital to the security of countries. And that's the global war on terrorism picture of taking a complex challenge and then opening it as a discussion for 195 Interpol member countries from a security standpoint. The more effective we are with communicating the information that's needed, that is problem solving, which helps protect the national security of countries, that allows alliances in order to effectively execute, the better chance you have of addressing the overall problem. And if you have one country that's dominant, that controls information flow and focuses only on its policy direction, while disregarding these other countries, or even a NATO, from a NATO collective defense standpoint, those alliance countries, we have a problem. And so that's the way we need to address issues. I open them cross-board when it's appropriate from a security and a humanitarian operations standpoint out to the entire audience, and target those key leaders and decision makers and the investigative media focuses that once an issue is prioritized or it's in the spotlight and there's an interest in it, that we make sure that the information that's needed to understand the problem set is in their hands, and to do that as effectively as possible, as comprehensively as possible. And that usually takes its own life and moves us in constructive directions. And if we don't have the superpowers, or they're conflicted, then that's all we're left with, is hope that a consensus building process and enough players will come in to counter the damage that's taking place, because there's not an interest in pursuing it in a constructive way.
You mentioned earlier talking about various NGOs and what they're telling their donors, and I know from my own personal experiences that coordinating between NGOs can sometimes be difficult. One, they may be hesitant to work with the military. Two, they're beholden to their donors, and their donors have a end sight in mind, or they're ideologically, inclined one way or another. So in building that consensus, what is your thoughts on a way to bridge across all of those obstacles to have people focus in the same direction?
You have to control the networks. You can't depend on organizations or others to bridge those gaps. You have to define the decision-making level and all of the specific interrelated groups and decision makers in those groups, and you have to have a direct line to them. And when there becomes a prioritized challenge that impacts their operations or their area of operations, then you make sure that the correct information flows and you shape that picture.
I have been following you for quite some time on LinkedIn. You and I have spoken once or twice on the phone as well. And recently you've started a newsletter to disseminate information. How has that process been? And what is your typical reception from people, when they read what you put out?
What that really is a support of all of the communication metrics from a cumulative standpoint. So instead of just one newsletter, I have all of these pieces that are operating continually. And that overview was articulating a support focus for it, only because many times people tell me that they don't have a pathway to specifically contribute to the organization and contribute to the efforts, and it just doesn't flow. Being effective and having a financial pipeline doesn't all the time connect together.
So I'm going to open it up here in a minute to questions. Something to ponder on or to expound on how you may feel is, what drives you every day to continue doing what you're doing? We talked a little bit earlier about burnout or things like that. Do you get discouraged, and what continues to drive you to push forward every day?
Well, I'm actively involved in ministry. HRI was formed as an interfaith organization from the very beginning. My faith base is the core of everything I've done for the last 30 years, and has actually the motivation to drive it. So keeping myself connected, keeping myself focused with that whole spiritual side is my lifeline. And my work with trying to expand resources that effectively connect with individuals that need to strengthen their own walk, or challenges as complicated as combat trauma and veteran suicide issues, and people on the most complicated, challenging spectrums, I continually work toward. So that pretty much is the focus. I've done studies in chaplaincy and in ministry work, and I bridge between the different interfaith groups and try to strengthen that side, because that's your core focus for, at least for me, for survival.
Open up, Jack, Terry, Todd, questions or thoughts. I know you guys are all practitioners and still stay involved in these areas. Any thoughts or questions? Yes, Jack.
First of all, thanks, Stephen, for doing this, and thank you, Doug, for yet again bringing in a good speaker to give us some serious thought. And I want to go back to one of the earlier questions that Doug asked, and it happens to be personally topical for me right now, and that is I'm going to phrase this carefully. Private groups that are getting heavily involved in not just the humanitarian response to complex humanitarian emergencies, but also branching out into areas where they are certainly getting ahead of U.S. national policy. It's funny to be sitting around with a bunch of former operators and realize that we're talking like value entrepreneurs who are trying to make an outcome happen when clearly the U.S. government isn't backing that outcome. And I think my personal kind of beef with this is I see it as a bit of a dilemma. At what point are we well-intentioned, almost charitable organizations working as PVOs against complex, in war zones? And at what point are we, in fact, becoming players in a war, or worse, becoming something that doesn't have the support or may not be in line with the objectives of the U.S. government? Saw a lot of that, and it's not like Operation Pineapple. That's just well-intentioned stuff. But some of the things I'm seeing about Ukraine right now, I'm starting to wonder if we are not, in fact, doing more for Ukraine as PVOs than the U.S. government is comfortable doing. And do you see that? Have you seen that as a dilemma? And how do we make sure we stay on sides with our own governments as we barge into these hostile environments and try to have an impact, an immediate impact, kind of at the tactical or operational level, divorced from any strategic or long-term policy objectives?
Well, the country of Ukraine, with being involved in Syria and watching red lines drawn and watching the international response to atrocities that tied in with those red lines, like the use of chemical weapons on populations, and the lack of enforcement or going in and accomplishing what your statements articulated, opened huge doors for those that viewed that as the lack of substance in the international security realm. So we saw Crimea invaded, the invasion, occupation, annexation. But then one of the most important things that was involved with Ukraine was the Budapest Memorandum for Security Assurances, 1994, where the key countries of the United States and Great Britain and Northern Ireland and Russia had negotiated to protect the country of Ukraine in the following the transfer of their nuclear weapon stockpiles. And that document and that treaty was critical in 2014, and it's the core of everything that we're watching right now, because once we ran into a situation where one of those signatories was the perpetrators of the crime or the invasion, then that was a focus that needed to be embraced by the international community. And in 2014, it wasn't. But that discussion, I believe, has a lot to do with how the mobilization and the interconnection of NATO and the international community has been to providing a lifeline and the tools that the Ukraine government needed to do to counter the threat metric. Now, the goal is to be ahead of the train. So the moment that we have information that provides feedback on a problem set, we need to be moving with strategic discussions and tools in order to best address that. And that's before the policies are set, or a policy that contradicts a specific strategic direction mobilizes. So that brings us back to a VSO in Afghanistan, and Scott Mann not being able to communicate effectively the reports and the success metrics, and how vital that was to the security of Afghanistan, and he was cut off from being able to communicate with the higher chains of command, and essentially, when those troops were pulled, all the hard work had gone down the tubes, and the Taliban came into many of those areas and killed the leaders that entrusted their lives to our forces, and it resulted in a catastrophe that came from a policy directive and the inability of those that were working on the ground that had important information that could prevent that spiral, or perhaps help in a strategic plan that would be more effective for a countrywide foreign internal defense objective. Those were gaps and needed to be filled. And those are the types of challenges that we have to face. There are many leaders that pull back and don't have the capacity to speak their own mind because they're trying to preserve their retirements and their jobs, and that comes in every realm. So these are the types of complicated variables that we have that obstruct progress. And when you're focused on the endpoint, the end game, which in my case starts with the humanitarian needs metric, that's your objective. And that encompasses every single discussion that's associated with that problem set, and how that fits in to a specific policy set or into the shaping of policy. Each circumstance has to play out.
Following up on Jack's question, do we see that as a good thing or a bad thing when PVOs are taking it upon themselves to seek an outcome, as Jack said, that may or may not be what governing bodies would like to see? Is that a good thing or bad thing?
You have to, it's like weighing every single media article that comes out. What is the focus? What is the objective? And how does that tie in to the equation? And that's how we either give weight to something or we disqualify it. And the focus from a defense standpoint, or is to fit those pieces together. I start with a view that VSO and SSTR needs to be the cornerstone of foreign internal defense, so that we have solution-oriented positive progressions within countries rather than tactical band-aids that are kinetic that allow them to be overrun by other elements or state sponsors or transnational terrorist and crime groups. And the importance of that framework of thinking to those that are entrusted with those operations and in civil affairs and the special operations community, and that's a doctrinal discussion.
All right, Stephen, I really appreciate your time today. Like I said, I've been wanting to have this conversation for a while. Unless there's any other question from the group, kind of take the last few minutes and just expound on anything that's on your mind to expound on. We have a smaller group here in person today, but I know that there's a lot of people that are wanting to hear from you. And so when this recording this goes out, there'll be a lot of people get a chance to hear what you had to say today. So just wrap us up with whatever salient comments you have that I think everybody should hear.
Okay, well, back to what I was just mentioning. I believe that village stability operations and stabilization, security, transition, reconstruction operations, and a comprehensive approach framework need to be the cornerstones of foreign internal defense. We need to be focusing on those areas from a strategic standpoint, from an operational standpoint, playing a key role in the realization of those objectives, how we conduct training, how we coordinate resource allocation, rebuilding and building of infrastructure, so on and so forth, so that the NATO ally countries or the United States becomes the key player in the failing or fragile state, or in any state where there's a complex emergency, where humanitarian affairs are the motivation for participation, where we're able to apply those same tools to benefit from a long-term that country and that region that we're able to take and work in. And that is a model that's grassroots. That's what needs to be done here in the United States. I'm pushing for unmet needs networks in every U.S. city, county area and reports to be constructed so we can have a grasp of what the executive directors of frontline service programs are facing, the challenge sets, their unmet needs landscape, making sure that that's communicated effectively to churches, youth leadership programs, small business, corporate, newspaper, radio, television, interfaith community, elected officials, so that we're mobilizing in relation to that grassroots state community service oriented direction that's solution oriented and will be effective. And all we're discussing on a global scale is the application of that same type of model. And that would be the most important focus point. Again, it's the VSO, SSTR, foreign internal defense landscape, and a whole strategic planning focus that is embraced from a leadership development standpoint, and it ties in with the human rights component and being an advocate that would create an environment that doesn't result in these massive combat trauma scenarios, or provides perspective for the operations that are taking place for a good cause that has a moral foundation. That's the most important objectives that I have today, and I would like communicated, and to serve as an entering wedge for expansion.
That's some pretty good words to wrap up on. Again, Stephen, thank you. I said I've been looking forward to this conversation. Reading your posts every day not only keep me informed, but they help keep me personally motivated, realizing, you know, the work that's still to be done out there. So thanks for everybody attended, and Stephen, I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. My pleasure.